Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kate Diamond and I work with the CIRTL Network, and I want to welcome everyone to our online event on interrupting and mitigating implicit bias when we see it. This is part of our series on addressing implicit bias in STEM, and it is the fourth and final event in the series. So we thank you very much for joining us today, especially those of you whose names are familiar from other events that we've hosted throughout the month. I do want to let folks know that this event is going to be recorded and shared on our public YouTube channel. All the other events in this series are also on that YouTube channel, which you can access at the link below. Before I turn things over to our hosts today and our speaker, I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the CIRTL Network, which is what's bringing us all together today. CIRTL is the Center for the Integration of Research, Teaching, and Learning. We are a network of universities in the US and Canada, about 40 universities, working together to teach STEM grad students and postdocs effective, inclusive teaching methods so that they can become both excellent researchers and teachers. And given that that's our mission, we are very excited to be able to host this series in an online format so that we can bring together as many people and as many different types of people from as many different types of institutions to learn and talk together about important issues like implicit bias in STEM. If you're looking to learn more about CIRTL, you can find out more about who our member institutions are and all of the wide array of online programming that we offer at our website. But for now, I will leave it at that and hand things over to our event hosts today so that they can kick off our programming.
Thank you, Kate. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Alexander, and I'm an instructional consultant at the Center for Teaching and Learning at IUPUI, and I'll be moderating today's session with Ann Borden and Caitlin Martin, who are both graduate student assistants here in the CTL with me. And now I'm going to turn it over to Ann, who's going to briefly introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Jessica. So I'm delighted to introduce our presenter today. Dr. Eva Pietri is an assistant professor at Indiana University, Purdue University of Indianapolis. She received her PhD in psychology at Ohio State University. After receiving her PhD, Dr. Pietri completed a postdoctoral position at Yale University, during which she worked in the psychology department and the Center for Scientific Teaching. Her research generally investigates how basic processes in social cognition and attitudes influence a variety of domains that are pertinent to real-world issues and can guide the creation of new interventions. Much of her current research focuses on reducing bias and promoting diversity in STEM fields. Dr. Petrie has been funded by the Spencer Foundation and published in a variety of journals, including the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, Psychology of Women Quarterly, and Journal of Personality. So now I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Ann. So each time that we've had a session, we have looked at the feedback and taken some elements of that. For this session, we've eliminated the polls so we can get to the discussion questions. I also just want to remind everyone about our box folder. In that box folder, you will see the PowerPoint, key terms, empty outline, which we encourage you to use as we go through some of the discussion questions and references. So before we get into those discussion questions, we just wanted to define some key terms. The first of which is implicit bias, which are unconscious negative associations that affect individuals' attitudes and actions, and they have real-world implications. The next is cultural competence, which is the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from cultures or belief systems different from your own. And this can also indicate the intention and effort to make systems and institutions more culturally responsive and inclusive. Our next term is positionality, which is how your context or identities like race, gender, class, and so on can affect how you construct knowledge in your worldview. And our last key term is culturally responsive pedagogy, which is a student-centered approach to teaching in which the student's unique cultural strengths are identified and nurtured in order to promote student achievement individuality and belonging. So again, we're going to format this session a little bit differently, and we are going to kick off with some discussion and reflection. Dr. Pietri will chime in as well during some of the discussion. So to review, we talked a little bit about intersectionality in a previous session. This figure here outlines intersectionality. The concept is there are different identities that people hold, and the ways in which those intersect is referred to as intersectionality. So for example, you can see in this figure on the right, Joey is a white youth with a learning disability who is eligible for free and reduced lunch services due to family income below the poverty line. And Amira is a Muslim youth of refugee status who identifies as gay. So intersectionality obviously impacts our worldview, our positionality, which leads us to our first discussion question. So as a member of a minority or majority group, how does your identity and demographic reality impact how you address implicit bias? In what ways does intersectionality play a role in your approach to implicit bias? As before, you can use the whiteboard function. These icons are listed to the right of your screen with the video on it. You can also raise your hand to participate and we will call on you. For those of you who are having trouble with the whiteboard, you can also post your comments within the chat box and we will address those as well. So we will give you a moment to go ahead and rate, and we will check in like 30 seconds. Okay, we see several people typing on the board. This is great. We encourage you to keep these comments coming as Catlin and I discuss some of them. And if you want to add on to your comment at any point, please raise your hand. We definitely encourage you to talk about these things. So we see a couple of people mentioning that you should call out bias when and where you can, specifically for white people, calling out other white people when mistakes are made and bias shows up. And this person has always commented that as a woman, they're sort of cautious when dealing with sexist bias, especially coming from men. And then for a lower income household growing up, avoiding topics about money because the feeling there is it's a bit uncomfortable. So for this person, it's all a balance between risk reward and responsibility for addressing bias. I think that's felt by a lot of people. This I think is a reason why white people sort of avoid these things when they come up, because they're not accustomed to dealing with race in their everyday lives, and so they just sort of ignore it and push it under the rug, because a lot of white people have been taught, including myself growing up, that oh well, you don't want to disrupt the norm, you don't want to be that person to say something, you're being rude, and that is a very, very difficult thing to break. But importantly, you can start to break these habits sort of slowly and sort of chip away at them so that you can really get at these things more head on. We also have another really great comment that ally is a verb. Just because you support minority causes does not mean you are not biased. That is absolutely true. As we've commented before, everyone has bias, no matter who you are, how much you care about things. Someone has said they realize that they are in the majority, but am unsure how to best address implicit bias. I would say that it's great that you're coming to to the CIRTL past sessions.
You're in the right place.
Yeah, you're definitely in the right place. We've talked about a variety of strategies with our previous sessions. If you have not attended those, the box folder includes the PowerPoints and all the resources from all those sessions, so we encourage you to look over those resources and to continue to engage in these conversations. So even though you're not sure of what to do, it's really important to keep engaging in these conversations, because it'll sort of become a little bit easier. It's just like learning how to ride a bike. When you first started riding a bike, you probably fell off a few times, but you eventually got the hang of it.
Mm-hmm. And lots of good comments here. If you feel that you've missed something, again, feel free to raise your hand and we can talk to you as well through the mic. Anne and Dr. Pietri, feel free to chime in if there is something that jumps out that you would like to address.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so someone says tempted to patronize minorities. Okay. Catlin, what are your thoughts on that?
You put me on the spot. Tempted to patronize minorities. Well, I'm not sure if this is directly in response to, Dr. Pietri. Go for it. Dr. Pietri to the rescue. So we'll go ahead. You can just push your mic and
okay. I think okay. Come back. With regard to this tempted to patronize minorities, there's been some work showing, so I'm thinking about this specifically from a teaching standpoint. So I'm not 100% sure if this is what the person was getting at with their comment, but when you teach or when you're mentoring, say, a graduate student or an undergrad, one might be tempted for women of color, or for white women of color, and for different underrepresented groups, to not provide critical feedback. So to try to patronize in the sense that you are trying to not be as critical as possible, just like sort of pat them on the head and say, oh, you did a good job, and make sure they feel good. But this is actually really not beneficial for students, or for anyone who's trying to develop in their career. So critical feedback tends to actually be really helpful in terms of us growing our skills. And when we just say, you did a great job, and you don't tell somebody how they can grow, that's actually a way of implicit bias actually playing a role, and it's a way of individuals not being as helpful as they can to different groups. And research has shown that both with regard to women generally and underrepresented groups or underrepresented minorities or women of color, so we need to acknowledge the intersection of the two as well. Individuals, professors are less likely to give more critical feedback to these groups than they are to give critical feedback to white men. And they're also less likely to give challenging tasks to these groups than they are to give challenging tasks to white men. And remember, those challenging tasks are what we can use to really grow and to improve in a field of study. So it's really important that if we see ourselves doing that we correct this behavior. And also, when giving critical feedback, one way that's really helpful for all students is to say, you know, I have these really high expectations for you. You didn't quite meet them, but the reason why I'm telling you this is because I really believe that you can meet these high expectations that I have for you. So I'm not saying this because I think you're bad. I'm not saying this because I think you're a horrible student, but it's because I have high expectations and I believe that you can grow and you can meet these high expectations. So I'm not 100% sure if that addresses that comment, but I do think it is really really important that we're careful about not allowing our implicit biases to play out in patronizing certain groups and, you know, just saying, oh, you did a great job, and not telling them the ways that they can improve. So hopefully that was helpful.
I think that was great. I think that got at that comment beautifully. So,
and if the person who made that comment would like to elaborate, again, feel free to raise your hand or type more on it. The thing that came to mind when I saw that comment too was sometimes the habit to put someone on the spot within a classroom context to speak on behalf of an entire demographic. So perhaps to say, you know, so-and-so, you're a woman, what do women think about this? I don't know if that would be considered patronizing, but again, avoiding that kind of mistake.
Yeah, and that is something that happens frequently to people who are part of minoritized groups. So we'll spend about 2 to 3 more minutes on this slide. Again, we structured our session a little bit differently to allow for more time. We have a comment up here in the top left corner. I'm particularly sensitive to issues of gender and sexuality because of my experiences as a queer trans man, especially when I witness bias of cisgender men. So again, this person is part of a marginalized group, and so they're sort of they can pick up bias sort of more easily than others because they experience it frequently. And we sort of see this echoed in a couple of different comments. So,
and again, it gets back to intersectionality as well. That's a perfect example of that.
So for example, in this comment in the bottom right, recognizing when I am in a position of power based on my identity. As a white woman, it's easier to recognize when I am not in that position, so similar to this queer trans man. When they're not in this position, it's easy to pick up on when the bias is perpetrated towards them. But it's more important to recognize when I am the person in power. And that's really important. It's so easy to call out people all day like, oh, well, you made this comment, you made this comment. But being able to respond in a respectful manner without making excuses, without attacking the person, without saying things like, oh, you're insensitive, or this isn't really what's happening, without minimizing their experience, that is very, very difficult. And again, this is why it's important to continually engage in this work.
That comment is so well said. I really identify with that. I mean, it's much easier when you're in the position where you feel as though you're being marginalized than when you're in the position of power and privilege.
And then we'll just go through a couple more comments. We'll spend about another minute here. I'm a black woman in a field that is increasingly dominated by white women. I use a lot of humor and gentleness when I can. So this sounds like a sort of coping mechanism to sort of cope with the comments that this person might be receiving. And then I guess we'll just go with this last comment here before we move on. I feel like majority folks are more bold. A lot of them don't recognize their own bias and privilege. So I feel like this person is saying they're bold in that they'll say these hurtful comments and without realizing just how impactful they are in such a negative way.
Or without the sensitivity.
Or without the sensitivity,
you know, take a second thought or take a second look at that.
So these were all great comments. As we move into our next discussion question, again, if there's something that you commented on here that you really want to address, to elaborate on, please feel free to raise your hand. We can allow you to speak through your mic. So our next question has to do a bit with microaggressions. So we just wanted to walk you through the different types of microaggressions. The first of which is microassaults, which are really more macro because they're often conscious. And so these are things that are said that are really meant to attack a person's identity or harm them through things like name calling, avoidance, or discriminatory actions. And so the person who's the perpetrator in this case has a level of anonymity, so they're not going to get caught. They're often among like-minded people, so again, it's sort of bolstering what they're thinking. And it happens when they often lose control in the situation. So if you think about things that you might have seen on social media recently where there's just this person sort of screaming at somebody, screaming derogatory comments, that is more of a micro-assault. Whereas a micro-insult is typically unconscious. So this is a statement that usually conveys a stereotype, some sort of rudeness or insensitivity towards a person based on their identity. So the comment here is, you're so well-spoken for an immigrant, and that's sort of conveying to that person that you don't belong in the U.S. or immigrants cannot speak English well. Right? And so again, the message there is that ultimately that only white people or people from the U.S. can speak English well. And then micro-invalidations are also unconscious, and so these comments can deny, exclude, and negate people's experiences and feelings of an individual or group. So saying something like sexism doesn't exist, or it's not as bad as it seems, or are you sure that's what they meant? I bet they meant this. And something really important here is that these comments you might be trying to help the person, right? Well, I'm sure it's not that bad, you know, you know, maybe they meant this, right? You're trying to make the person feel better about the situation, but
you're invalidating it.
Yeah, you're invalidating the person in reality, so it often doesn't work the way that you think it would. So this can lead individuals to question their experience. A lot of these things result in gaslighting by the perpetrator.
Can you talk a little bit about what gaslighting is?
Yeah, so gaslighting, again, is like, well, this didn't really happen. This isn't the case. Like, sexism doesn't exist. We have women on the Supreme Court. Like, we had Hillary Clinton ran for president, whatever argument they want to make to sort of invalidate your experience. So then the person is up there thinking, well, I'm overreacting. You know, maybe the issue's with me. There was this recent publication by Harrison and Tanner in 2018 about microaggressions specifically in science, and they're broken down here again by microassaults, microinsults, and microinvalidation. And so you can, we had someone raise their hand from CELT at Iowa State. Go ahead and speak. You can turn on your mic.
Sure. Our question is, why is it a microassault rather than just an assault?
Why is it called a microassault instead of just an assault? That's a good question. That's a good question. We're not the ones who came up with this terminology, so I'm not sure. Like I said before, it's really more macro. It's more, especially because there's a level of consciousness there.
Yeah.
I would say with maybe how many times it occurs, that's how law enforcement or other individuals may perceive it.
I would call it macroaggression too.
Yeah.
Wherever they're getting the information.
I'm sorry, what was the comment? I couldn't quite hear it. Yeah. I couldn't quite hear what was just said.
Someone just typed, I would call it a macroaggression, and we were saying, yeah, it kind of is more of a macroaggression, but we would need to read the article that you associated the terminology with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Especially too, I'm going to go back a slide. I was thinking that as well when we were going through this, where it's often conscious, and even Jessica said it's on a macro level, that it is a bit of an oxymoron.
My assumption would be that it's classified as micro because no one is actually physically harmed their name calling, even though with a lot of these statements that are made that are microassaults, they're emotional. You can't imagine how someone would say that. So does that answer your question? Before we move on?
Or if anyone else has anything to add.
You can move on, it's okay.
Okay. And someone has typed in the definition of a microassault, which is a form of microaggression involving purposeful discriminatory action such as a verbal attack or avoidant behavior. So again, this is probably why it's not considered more of a macro thing, because nobody is physically hurt, and it might be a one-time thing, like if you encounter someone in the grocery store and you decide to call them some names. That might be a one-time thing. So we see some micro assaults listed on the left-hand side. So it's so gay that we can't get this assay to work, or it's ridiculous that anybody believes in God. And so the thing here is that the message for the first one is that being gay is bad or abnormal because you're relating it to not getting your experiment to work. Or for the second one is that religious people cannot be scientists. You don't belong in this group. And then for micro-insults, like if you're a female in the class, oh, well, I didn't do well, but, you know, I'm not supposed to be good at science anyways. And so the message there being that sort of thinking about the in-group, women cannot be good at science, so the stereotype that women aren't smart. And then we have this comment related to an accent and how it makes them sound unscientific. And so the message here is that you cannot have an accent and be a scientist, or be talented, be intelligent. And then a micro-invalidation. Race isn't an issue in our department. Students just need to take better advantage of the resources. So students' racial experiences do not matter. And then the last one, the book is expensive, but it shouldn't be an issue. Just have your parents pay for it. So students' financial situations are not an issue in my class. I think this also plays into an assumption that maybe for the student's financial situation, maybe it's impacted by the fact that they don't have parents, or maybe they come from a single parent household. So there's also those assumptions in that last statement as well. And so that leads into our next question. So for STEM instructors, what are some strategies specific to addressing hot moments? And these hot moments might be something related to some of the microaggressions that we just discussed. So what are some ways that you can address these in the classroom? And so again, you can use the whiteboard function here, or if you really want to get your comment out, feel free to raise your hand or type into the chat box. And you may not have witnessed these in the classroom, so you can definitely talk about some things that you might have heard around your campus. Okay, so those of you who are typing or coming up with some ways to address hot moments, please feel free to continue typing. I just wanted to follow up. We had a couple more comments related to our discussion about why micro assaults are categorized as micro when they're conscious behavior. And someone stated, I wonder if the author was attempting to describe different kinds of microaggressions. They are micro because each one instance builds and builds over time, so it's, again, one smaller action. Micro assaults are also not necessarily intended to escalate a situation and likely can't be held legally liable. Yeah, the First Amendment protects free speech, so you can scream a lot of different horrible things at people and probably not have any sort of crime consequence or anything happen to you. And then our last comment here, I assume macro assault is literally assault in the physical sense or harassment, which is the intention to harm. Micro assault can still have an ambiguous intention behind it. Yeah, so this person can sort of hide their intentions and say, oh, well, you know, you misunderstood what I was trying to get at, yeah. Okay, so again, please feel free to keep typing and commenting. We can start going through the comments though. So first one is acknowledge the lens from which I teach, but also validate and appreciate perspectives different from my own. Yeah. So a lot of us going into teaching think, oh, well, this is how I learned, so I'm going to teach. So I'm going to teach this way, and so our experience can really frame the way in which we teach, and that's why it's important to really delve into what evidence-based practices really are, as well as culturally responsive pedagogy. And that has to do with positionality, which was another one of our terms today. Yeah, if you've come from a background in which you were able to have a really excellent education leading up to college, then you're probably going to do better than your peers simply because of that your education beforehand. The next comment, just working from the top left down, interrupt, address, and address the situation, not the person. So that's important, right? Not really yelling at the person, not calling them out, but like, here's what I'm observing. So addressing the situation in the moment. If it's in a large classroom setting, maybe following up with the person one-on-one afterwards. The goal is to correct the behavior, yes. So many are unconscious bias, and it's embarrassing people isn't productive much of the time, yeah. So again, like not attacking the person, not trying to make them feel embarrassed, but getting at the behavior aspect. We have a question on the whiteboard. Any suggestions for when a male colleague is talking down to a female colleague repeatedly in a meeting? So if you are a male and if you're witnessing this, this is an excellent opportunity for you to use your positionality and your privilege, being a male as well, to interrupt that and be like, listen, she has a great idea, or listen, you're not being respectful here. Like, this isn't the way you should be talking to somebody.
So if anyone else too has feedback on that, feel free to comment.
I would encourage you to do that if you're a female as well, but depending on the climate in the room and how many other females are present in that room, that may alter the dynamic. So I certainly hope that there's some avenue for you to report to, whether that is a supervisor or your department chair or whatnot. So maybe if you're not comfortable saying something in the meeting, definitely try to say something to someone higher up to address that behavior.
And that's not exclusive to gender, right? I mean,
right.
Race, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, etc.
So moving on to another comment. Part of my teaching philosophy is that I am training scientific citizens, which means when these things come up, I feel okay interrupting lessons to address them as they break down scientific progress. Being able to collaborate without controversy and conflict is a skill that I feel obligated to teach as well. So yeah, this is sort of incorporating this learning goal of learning to work with others who are different from you, in addition to maybe the learning goals that you have related to, I want people to be able to analyze data or learn about whatever subject they're in.
And Dr. Pietri and Anne, feel free to chime in as well.
Definitely. So then on the right here, starting at the top, we have develop a code of conduct for discussions that you're anticipating will be controversial or emotionally charged, or similarly an operational agreement in which all students agree upon. That's a great strategy. Depending on when you're at in the semester, if you have these conversations frequently, you could put that into your syllabus as well, or you could have it at the start of the discussion, or both. Never hurts to remind students of these things frequently.
And that's kind of getting at ground rules, is what I understand.
Yeah. These are you might come across these in the literature as like ground rules for discussion. Someone has stated that Kathy Aubert has an amazing amount of information on her website, and that's at drkathyaubert.com to help with navigating, including Pay Attention Now. So these sounds, and then there's another one's called. I'm not familiar with. I'm not familiar with these, but these sound like strategies for like active listening or maybe addressing these.
Clarifying.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So this sounds like you're actively listening. You're asking questions to clarify the intention. You're interrupting it. It sounds like maybe you're trying to relate the person and share with others. Is possibly what that's.
Again, feel free to clarify if that's your comment.
I'm going to move this comment. That way we can see everything. So someone says, I'd like to talk about opinion versus facts, scientific evidence versus opinions. This can be depending on the type of person, a good way to break down these barriers. Something to keep in mind is that some people might not feel that certain types of evidence are valid. For example, people who think that gender studies isn't a real subject, for example, and keeping in mind who's been allowed to do the research in the past. But I think that can be a viable strategy, especially in the STEM classroom. We have a comment, I find it very difficult to have this discussion when religious beliefs are involved. So for example, if a student believes in creationism, a lesson about evolution. I agree. Yeah, that can be difficult. I remember asking a graduate student about how she would handle this, and her answer, which I thought was pretty good, was that she was presenting evidence for this theory, and the purpose of the scientific evidence is to be able to explain the world around us. And so, given all the information out there, that really, from all the evidence that was out there, that really led to this theory of evolution. So sort of coming from it at, this is what the science is telling us, rather than, well, your religion is wrong, and so you just need to get over it. We have a comment, I wish I was fast enough to address it in the moment. When I feel like I have not done a good job in the classroom and the microaggression has been unconscious, I've asked the students to chat during office hours. That is great that you're not just ignoring it. It is really hard to address in the moment. Depending upon the comment, you might be really taken aback by what the student has said, and so you might need a few moments to figure out how exactly you want to address it, and that is perfectly fine. Okay, and then one last comment. I tried to raise the point that the female colleague brought up a great point and then asked for ideas based on that point. So that's related to this question of any suggestions for when a male colleague is talking down to a female colleague. Yeah, that's a great way. Basically validating that they've made a good contribution.
And using your position, especially if you're a man of privilege and power, you know, in order to address that.
Okay, so we've been talking for quite a while now, and this has been great discussion. We appreciate all these comments here. Now we're going to turn it over to Dr. Pietri, who's going to talk a bit about her work and how it relates to addressing these implicit biases.
Great, thank you. So this has been a great discussion, and it's been really interesting to hear everyone's thoughts. So this was really helpful in leading up to my presentation and thinking about things I want to make sure I address. So I'm going to start my presentation with sort of a more negative view on how we can change implicit biases, or how we can't. So unfortunately, these implicit or sort of automatically activated biases that we have are really hard to change. And in fact, there's been research demonstrating this. So, oh, whoops. Let me go. How do I go back? Okay, never mind. Nope. I'm trying to have the rest of my text appear. Do you know how to? There we go. Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's just, okay, perfect. It's like my text is not appearing. All right, so unfortunately, implicit biases are hard to change, and we know from a very large intervention study that short interventions that reduce implicit biases may not have long-lasting effects. So in particular, this research was done by a team of researchers across many different labs. They had a large sample of participants, so between 5,000 and 10,000 participants. This was pretty rigorously done as well, so they pre-registered this work. And they found that, unfortunately, interventions that we know from the empirical psychological literature that reduce implicit biases, they'll have short-term effects, so that's the good news. But after a few days, we see that this effect goes away, so these implicit biases return. And in some ways, this makes sense when we think about how these biases form in the first place. So they form in part because we see stereotypical representations of different groups in the media and in society. And as a result, because we live in society, after we undergo these interventions and we return to our normal lives, it makes sense that these biases would reappear. So what this means is that we're going to have to consistently work to address biases and employ the different strategies that we talked about today that you've learned from other sessions to ensure that these biases don't negatively impact our behavior. So I actually want to pause for a moment. So I just told you that implicit biases are really hard to change. I can't give you a single intervention. I can't say, go to this website, do this intervention, and they're gone. And so I'm just curious, really quickly, if the group could reflect on how this makes them feel. So how do you feel, having learned a lot about the negative effects that these implicit biases can have from the previous sessions, having me start by saying, there's nothing you can do to make them go away. So we're not going to have a whiteboard for this, but if anyone wants to either talk or chat really quickly, I'll pause for a minute. Are there any thoughts on this? Or is everyone just okay with this? Like, nothing we can do.
You can also, even though we don't have a whiteboard site, yes, you can write text in the space that's available on the site if you would like.
Makes me feel worried. Yep.
Iowa State, you can go ahead.
Okay. All right, I see one more.
Okay, so Greta, I think you could share, Greta. Share. Can you hear me? I was just saying that I don't think it's that big a deal knowing that implicit biases can't change, because I think that our focus should be on making sure that we recognize our implicit biases and do as much as we can to make sure our implicit biases don't affect our students as much.
So that's a really great point. So to do the different, to employ different strategies to make sure that they're not harming the students. I see a lot of other really good points, so it makes me feel more worried than before, which is a great point. Frustrated, that's also a really good point. Interventions must be deployed strategically, so training right before search and screening applicants. So that's a good point. So having these interventions, say before, I'm actually on a search committee right now, so before you start on a search committee, maybe strategically throughout being on the search committee. There are things that can, so I feel like there are things that can be done to reduce the effect of these biases, which is also a really great point. Just to make sure I don't miss anything in the chat. Okay, so I see the scapegoating is here too. So implicit biases can operate as a scapegoat, and it's better to correct behavior which ultimately has a real impact. And so if it's okay with everyone, I think I might end on that point because I really, really like that point. So you sometimes hear that conversation. So this idea that implicit biases are really hard to change, we all tend to have them. I actually remember watching, I don't know if anyone's seen the musical Avenue Q, which is a musical that's been around for a while, but they have a song in it that they sing, well, it involves puppets, so it's kind of a silly but fun musical, but they sing a song that says everyone's a little bit racist, which leads to the idea that, well, we all have these biases, everyone's a little bit racist, and it sort of normalizes the behavior and then makes us think, well, okay, I have these biases, there's nothing that can be done, I guess I'm just going to live with them, it's fine. And it also, thinking that implicit biases are really hard to change, we see some of these ideas echoed in the comments that it leads to frustration, it makes people worried, it might lead people to just say, well, there's nothing that can be done, so I'm just not going to try. So I want to mention, the reason why I wanted everyone to reflect on this is because it's really important that we still remember that we can address biases. Okay, great. And it's really dangerous. So if I were to say, okay, believing nothing can ever be done, so we do know that these biases are hard to change. However, believing that we can't do anything is a really dangerous idea. And it's a really bad idea, not one that I want to promote during this presentation. And I think from the comments, you all were intuiting that this can be very negative, to believe that there's nothing we can do. And so as a result, it's important that we do think of the different strategies that we can use to help ensure that implicit biases don't negatively impact our behavior. So I want to mention that when we believe that biases are fixed or we can't do anything to change them, so if we're just like, well, okay, it's fine, I'm going to have these biases, I'm going to be a little bit sexist, I'm going to be a little bit racist, I'm going to have biases against different groups, when people hold those beliefs, they're less likely to use strategies to reduce the impact of personal biases on their behavior. And they're less likely to confront unfair treatment when they see it. So individuals who believe that biases are fixed wouldn't use any of the strategies that we just talked about to address biases when they see it in the classroom. They would just say, well, okay, there's nothing that can be done, I'll just let that person be biased. So as a result, it's really important that individuals are aware of biases, so aware of the way that biases can impact their behavior and how they can influence us, while at the same time knowing and using strategies that can help reduce the impact of implicit biases on their evaluation and treatment of other people. So there are two really important components that I want to emphasize during this presentation. So first, we need to be aware of the biases, and as being a part of this CIRTL class, and if you're a part of the other sessions, you've learned about the different ways that these implicit biases can impact your behavior. So that's really great. You've been working on that first part, that awareness component. And in fact, the American Association for the Advancement of Science argues that awareness is a really important precursor for ultimately combating bias. However, the second component is just as important. So we also need to be aware of concrete strategies that we can use to help address the implicit biases that we have, and even if we continue to have them, to make sure that they don't negatively impact our behavior, especially in the classroom. And so it's important that we're aware of strategies, that we have them, and also that we always remind ourselves that these biases can change. We can continue to employ strategies, we can continue to employ interventions, and it's just something that we need to continue to work on. And so examining both this awareness component as well as the having strategies, the self-efficacy component, is some work that my colleagues and I have done, and we've been looking at specific interventions to address both issues. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. So in particular, my colleagues and I wanted to create an easy-to-administer intervention that would help address the awareness component. And specifically with this intervention, we were aiming to address gender bias in STEM, and we developed the Video Interventions for Diversity in STEM, or VIDS for short. And in particular, this intervention consisted of 2 video presentational styles. So the first set, the narratives, involves short stories that demonstrated examples of gender bias that we know from the empirical literature. So they were written by a professional playwright because we wanted to ensure that they were emotionally evoking and engaging. And also, to make sure they were high quality, we hired a professional film crew and professional actors to produce them. So this wasn't just a situation where I was filming with my iPhone and my friends were acting as actors. We did want these to be high quality. And in total, we created 6 5-minute videos. The second set of videos were the expert interviews, and these involved interviews with supposed psychology professors who in reality were, again, professional actors, and they talked about the research underscoring each of the accompanying narrative videos. So both presented the same information about gender bias, however, just in different formats. And in initial research that we've done with the videos, we found really promising results, specifically with STEM faculty. So we found that both presentational styles increased awareness of gender bias in STEM, reduced subtle sexism, and increased the STEM faculty's behavioral intentions to recruit and mentor more women in the sciences. And we followed up with these STEM faculty 1 week later, and we found some evidence that these results persisted for at least 1 week after the intervention. So we are really excited about these initial findings. We thought this was really promising because this is a really short 30-minute intervention that can be done online, and we were finding all these positive effects, specifically with our target audience, so with STEM faculty. However, one issue and limitation with the videos is that they were only addressing that awareness component. So they were increasing awareness of the issue, but we were completely failing at giving STEM faculty concrete strategies to help address the gender bias issue. So now they were aware of it, but they didn't actually know how to go into their STEM classrooms and address it. And so in this way, we were really only addressing half of the problem. So in a follow-up study, we wanted to help address this limitation with the videos and start to think of new ways that we can help raise self-efficacy or help STEM faculty feel like there's something that they can do to address this issue. So to do this, we created a new tool to complement the video interventions that we already had. And in particular, we developed a short Overcoming Bias module, which just presented information in a video format, but similar to the way that you would see information presented in a PowerPoint. So this Overcoming Bias module began by talking about how, although biases are pervasive in STEM, it's important to know that they can change and there are things that we can do to address them. And then really importantly, at the end of the module, we presented 5 concrete tips that STEM faculty can use in their STEM classroom to help address biases and to make sure that they have an inclusive classroom. And these tips ended up forming the acronym UNITE, so that's what you see here on the screen. And so we've referred to this module then as the UNITE module when we've talked about it in research. So we wanted to see then if our new UNITE or Overcoming Bias module would help address this issue. So to do this, we recruited 130 STEM faculty, majority of who were at R1 universities and were associate or assistant professors. And we randomly assigned them in this experiment to either watch the VIDS video intervention or control videos, which were clips taken from science documentaries and were pilot tested to ensure they were equally as entertaining as the videos, as the narrative videos, and equally as informative as the expert interviews. And I also want to note that in the VIDS intervention, we specifically had participants watch the combination of the narratives and expert interviews. We then randomly assigned participants to either watch the Overcoming Bias module or a control module that talked about inclusive scientific teaching practices, active learning practices that you can include in the classroom. So it was still talking about the classroom. It was talking about just focusing on active learning and how that's helpful for students. So then we assessed participants' awareness of bias, their subtle sexism, their self-efficacy to address gender bias, and their beliefs that gender bias is fixed and there's nothing that they can do to address it. And we measured this before they underwent the intervention and then after they underwent the intervention. So we had our baseline scores, which were collected 2 days before the intervention, and then we measured these outcomes specifically right after the intervention. So after they watched either VIDS or their control, or after they watched the Overcoming Bias module or the control module. And so now I'm going to present some of the results from this experiment. So the scores here that I'm showing represent change from baseline scores. And what you see is that the videos increased awareness of gender bias in STEM and decreased sexism. So we're just seeing a main effect of the videos. So that was nice. It replicated previous work that we found. However, next looking at perceptions that gender bias is fixed and can't change and self-efficacy, what we see here, and it's what we expected, our videos don't do anything to help increase perceptions that gender bias can change, and they don't help increase self-efficacy. And so what we're finding here is that Overcoming Bias module is decreasing perceptions that gender bias is fixed and increasing self-efficacy to help address gender bias in the STEM classroom. And so this demonstrates that we really need to have interventions that both increase awareness of gender bias while at the same time also provide concrete tips for addressing gender bias in the STEM classroom. And so we do see that our video was really only accomplishing half of this goal, and it was helpful to add this second component. So because it is so important to know these concrete tips, what you can do to help address biases generally in one's classroom, I want to end my presentation now by talking about 3 tips for addressing bias in the classroom. And in particular, these are 3 tips taken from that Overcoming Bias or Unite module. So these are some of the tips that we actually showed STEM faculty when we were conducting that experiment. So the first tip I want to highlight is do grade tests and assignments blind when you can. Establish a grading rubric for each assignment, so really have a clear set of criteria that you're going to use for each assignment before you grade it to ensure that your biases don't change what criteria you focus on or highlight for each student. So if you don't like a student, you might say, well, this criteria is really important, but this other criteria is not. But if you have a clear rubric, you're less likely to do that. And make sure that you call on different groups. So I said call on men and women equally, but this is important for all different groups. Call on different groups of students equally in class. And really, really importantly, and I think this has been a theme throughout this whole presentation today, don't just assume that biases will not affect you, because even if you undergo an intervention or you take an online class to help address implicit biases, remember there's that possibility that they will return, and so we always want to be employing strategies to make sure that these implicit biases have the least amount of impact on our behavior. Another strategy is to make sure that you're using, so again, these were taken from the Unite module, so you're specifically focusing on gender bias, but you want to use diverse pictures of scientists, so female scientists, women of color scientists, different groups that have been underrepresented in the sciences. Also make sure that you discuss the accomplishment of diverse scientists, researchers, and use inclusive language, for example, saying things such as humankind instead of mankind. And don't only have pictures of white male scientists. And why this is important is because we know from the psychological research that seeing diverse groups of individuals or diverse groups of scientists can help reduce our implicit biases. And so as a result, this is one way to help reduce the biases that your students might have. And then also when you're preparing the lecture, when you're giving the lecture and seeing this, this will also help reduce the biases that you have. And also, we know that when we see diverse groups of scientists or counter-stereotypical exemplars, it helps students feel who aren't just white men, feel a sense of belonging in your class. So they see, oh, that person looks like me, that person's like me, that means I can do this field, I can be successful in this field. And then finally, do emphasize that students can be successful in the sciences. Remind students that if they perform poorly on a test, they can and will improve. And don't suggest that people who succeed in the sciences have a special talent that they're born with. So what I'm saying here is really emphasize that growth mindset and don't just focus on the idea that, well, if you don't do well, you're maybe not going to do well in the class. So we want to have a growth mindset with students. And I want to end on this growth mindset because I think it's also really important that we have a growth mindset when we think about our own biases. So there is the possibility, so I started off when I said, well, we know that these implicit biases will return. It's really hard to employ an intervention that will have these long-lasting effects. However, and again, that's negative. We don't like to have, that makes us feel frustrated. It doesn't make us feel good, so we don't want to end on that. So it's really important to have a growth mindset when we think about our own biases. So to say, well, I know this is something I continually need to work on improving. I know I need to make sure that I use these strategies in my class. And even if you don't, say, employ every inclusive strategy the first time you teach, knowing that you can continue to include them and have a growth mindset with the way that you're teaching. Also know if you make a mistake, that's okay. You can apologize for it, and you can say, I'm going to continue to work on this, and I will improve. So an example from my own life, one really bad habit that I do sometimes in class is instead of saying things like you all, which is more inclusive, I'll say you guys, which is not inclusive. And so this is a problem. This is something that I need to work on. This is my biases coming into play when I teach. And so as a result, I apologize to my class. I say, this isn't something that I want to use. I'm sorry when I use that terminology. And I'm going to continue to work on it and know that I can and will improve. So it's important that we promote a growth mindset for our students, but that we also have a growth mindset for ourselves. Okay? So that's all I had for my presentation, but I'm happy, I know we'll have a little bit of time for some sort of wrap-up discussion, and then I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pietri. We really appreciate it. So as we are short on time, instead of summarizing things that you've learned today, we're just going to open it up to see if you have any burning questions for Dr. Pietri. You can either write those in the chat box or raise your hand. And then I believe Kate Diamond from CIRTL will come to wrap things up. I also want to mention that we have a list of select publications from Dr. Pietri that's in the box folder as well. So again, go ahead and write in the chat box or raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll wait and see. Thanks. Thank you.
I see two questions in the chat box that appeared when I was giving my talk, so I wanted to make sure I addressed them. So the first question, are these available for anyone to use? They are. There is a website where you can access the videos. I'm happy to share that with everyone. If maybe I could share it with the facilitators today and we could put it in the shared box folder. And then the other, so somebody mentioned that these videos are, so I know that these videos can be really uncomfortable to watch. I know there's actually another CIRTL class that's using the videos right now, and they are infuriating. They hit close to home and are hard to watch, and I'm assuming if you've experienced these biases. And so I really, really appreciate that. And it's something that we have thought about in our, so it's especially as women in STEM, if you've experienced these, it can be hard to watch it. It can be hard to think about the ways that you may have experienced these biases. And we have a new paper that just came out talking about the different ways that we can work to address the threatening nature of the video for women in STEM. The problem is it's important that we're all aware of these issues because even women can have biases towards other women. So even if we're part of a group, so I'm thinking like I'm a woman and I'm Puerto Rican, but I could still have biases against women. I could still have biases against other underrepresented groups in STEM. And so unfortunately, we can't just only have half of the population watch the video, so only show the videos to men. But I really appreciate that these videos can be threatening and can make people uncomfortable. And it is something that, as researchers, we're working to look at different ways to address this.
So we want to be mindful of everyone's time. We know that we are at our mark. So again, we really appreciate all the feedback we've received. So please go ahead and give us feedback through the links that are posted. If you have other questions for Dr. Pietri, we can wait a couple of minutes afterward. I just wanted to be, again, cognizant of those who have to leave. So Dr. Pietri, if you have anything you want to add, feel free to do so.
Yeah, and I can hang around for a bit, so if anyone has any questions about what I talked about today, I'm happy to answer them.
So one of the questions that I thought were really good is here from Rebecca, and she asks, how would you recommend mitigating bias that you witness in your superiors?
Okay, so how would you mitigate bias that you witness in your superiors? That's a really tough one because obviously there's a lot of great work done by my colleague, Dr. Leslie Esch-Bernardo, who I believe actually presented a few sessions ago, and it shows that we are nervous about addressing bias when, sort of confronting or speaking up when we see bias by a person who's in a power position, so who could harm us. And I know as a non-tenured professor, this is something that I think about as well. And so one thing that I would suggest is if you have so either if you're a student and you have a professor who's an ally or somebody who you can trust and talk to, you might consider going to that person. So either a trusted, somebody who's just in a little bit of a higher power position than you, and talk to them and say, well, I noticed that this was happening, or I noticed this bias happening in my graduate level class, but I'm really uncomfortable confronting the professor because they could write me a bad letter, or they could harm my grade. So if you have anyone that's an ally that you can talk to and who is in a higher position of power, then they can potentially know the right channels to go through, or they can talk to that person and not put you at risk or at jeopardy, because that is a really difficult situation, and I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that students put themselves in put themselves in harm's way because they're working to address all the biases that they see. So I hope that's why allies are really so important, especially allies who are in positions of power. Or if there's any sort of student, sometimes there are student advocacy groups or a specific center on campus that is focused on helping advocate for graduate students. So if there's anyone maybe even above at a dean's level or that you could go talk to if somebody is doing really egregious behavior. So I want to, I see one question, why were actors used for the expert and not actual, why didn't we use actual interview experts? Part of the reason we did this was just to control the content. So we wanted to actually make sure that we were hitting on very specific points with the experiments and do so in a way that was really easy for individuals who weren't psychologists to understand. So I wrote the script, but in collaboration with the playwright, so to make sure it wasn't horribly boring, because my writing's not that great. And then we pilot tested the scripts. So we did actual read-throughs with the scripts with a group of graduate students as well as professors, and we asked them to provide feedback on the scripts in the read-through. And then we also pilot tested them with a group of graduate students, and we changed things based on the feedback to make sure that they were really easy to understand and clear. So we hired the professional actors because we didn't want to actually make a professor of psychology read our very specific script. And then we had the actors read off a teleprompter, which is apparently a very hard skill to have. And so you hire very specific actors who can read off a teleprompter. And so it was just a matter of really making sure that the content was accessible to all individuals, not too jargony, and also because we didn't want to make an actual professor memorize a script and then not sound natural and like the interview was actually really occurring, if that makes sense. Sure.
All right, thank you everyone for all those questions. So we're about 5 minutes over right now. We just want to remind you to please give us your thoughts on our post-event survey. We'll be hanging out for a few minutes as people are leaving the chat room. And again, if there's any more questions for Dr. Pietri or for Catlin or myself, we'd be happy to answer those as well.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.